My husband called me from a golf course in Scottsdale on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because I was in the middle of a patient consultation and my phone buzzed 3 times before I stepped out to answer it. "I want a divorce," he said, "and I've already talked to a realtor about the practice." I stood in the hallway of the clinic we had built together, the one with my name on the lease, my name on the medical license, my name on every certificate framed above the reception desk, and I said, "Okay." He laughed. Not a mean laugh, just surprised, the way someone laughs when they expect a fight and don't get one. "That's it? Just okay?" "Drive safe," I said, and went back in to finish the consultation. What he didn't know was that I'd been waiting for that call for 11 months. My husband, I'll call him that because that's still what he was, legally, had been having an affair with a woman named Tatum for almost 2 years. I found out the way a lot of women find out, not through some dramatic confrontation, but through a receipt. A hotel in downtown Phoenix. A Friday night, he told me he was in Portland for a conference. I didn't say anything. I just started paying attention. I'm a physician. I specialize in internal medicine. My entire career is built on the belief that if you observe carefully enough, the body will tell you what's wrong before the symptoms become a crisis. I applied the same logic to my marriage. Over the following months, I documented everything. Not because I was vindictive. I want to be clear about that. I documented everything because my husband had access to joint accounts, a shared LLC we used for the practice's real estate holdings, and a business manager named Clifford, who I had begun to suspect was less loyal to the practice than he was to the man who played golf with him every weekend. The practice was mine in every meaningful sense. I'd built it from a single exam room and a shared medical suite in Tempe 11 years ago. My husband had a real estate background. He came in as the operations manager when we expanded to a second location, and he was good at it. Genuinely good. I want to be fair about that too. But over time, the credit had shifted. He had a personality that filled rooms. Mine doesn't. So when people in our professional circle talked about the Aldrich Family Health Group, they talked about him as if he built it. He never corrected them. What I had quietly done over the years was ensure that the legal structure of the practice reflected reality. Every LLC was structured so that no major asset transaction could occur without my signature. The real estate was held in a trust in my name alone, established before we married. The patient records, the contracts with our 2 largest insurance networks, the lease agreements on all 3 locations, all of them had clauses that tied authority to my medical license, not to a joint management agreement. My husband had signed off on all of it years ago in the middle of a refinancing that Clifford had assured him was routine. It was routine. It was also very carefully written. When he called me from Scottsdale to tell me he'd spoken to a realtor, he was talking about selling a building he didn't have the legal authority to sell. I let him enjoy the weekend. When I got home Sunday evening, he was in the kitchen, and there was a woman sitting at my kitchen island who I had never seen before. She had the posture of someone who had been rehearsing this moment. Shoulders back, chin level, a small smile that said she was expecting me to fall apart. "This is Tatum," my husband said, and I could hear in his voice that he'd been waiting for this too. He wanted the scene. He wanted me to cry or yell or say something that would make him feel righteous about what he'd already decided. I set my bag down on the chair by the door. I looked at her. I said, "I know who you are." The smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "We should talk about the transition plan," my husband said, "for the practice. I've already been in contact with a buyer." I walked to the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, and sat down at the kitchen table. "Tell me about the buyer." He seemed thrown off by my calmness, but pushed through it. The buyer was a private equity group out of Scottsdale, the same city he'd been in when he called me. They were interested in acquiring independent primary care practices, rolling them up into a larger network. He'd been in conversations with them for 4 months. 4 months, I said. "It's a good offer. You'd walk away with more than enough to what?" He stopped. "To start over?" I said. "To be grateful and quiet?" I opened the water bottle. "How much did they offer?" He told me the number. It was a real number, substantial actually. What it represented, though, was about 40% of what the practice was actually worth, based on the valuation I'd quietly commissioned 8 months earlier from a healthcare M&A firm in Chicago. Tatum shifted on her stool. I think she'd expected tears by now. The problem, I said, is that you can't sell it. It's a joint asset. It's not. I stood up and went to my bag, pulled out a folder I'd carried home from the office that afternoon. I'd been waiting for the right moment to put it on the table, and this was it. Sit down, I said to my husband. This is going to take a few minutes. I walked him through everything. The trust documents, the LLC operating agreements, the insurance network contracts, the lease agreements. Each page had a tab, color-coded with the relevant clause highlighted. I prepared it with my attorney, a woman named Rosemary who had been practicing healthcare law in Arizona for 26 years and had never once lost an asset dispute. My husband's face changed slowly, the way color drains from someone who's received bad news they're not ready to process. Tatum, at some point, picked up her purse. I'll see myself out, she said. Neither of us acknowledged her. You set this up on purpose, he said after she was gone. I set it up correctly, I said. There's a difference. He stayed that night, awkward and silent, and was gone by Monday morning. I went to work. I had patients at 7:30. The next 2 weeks were the ugliest. His attorney sent letters, mine responded. He tried to argue that the trust had been established with marital funds, which was technically creative, but factually incorrect. I had records of the initial deposit going back to an inheritance from my grandmother 5 years before we married. He tried to argue that his operational contributions to the practice had created an implied equity interest. Rosemary responded to that one with a 60-page brief that I genuinely enjoyed reading. What he didn't know yet, what I hadn't told him or his attorney, was that Clifford had been doing something very specific with the practice's vendor accounts for the past 3 years. I had noticed the first discrepancy 18 months earlier, a billing line in our supply invoices that didn't match any purchase order I could find. Small, at first, a few $100s, then more frequent. I brought it to Clifford in what I presented as a routine audit question, and he explained it smoothly, the way people who have been lying for a long time explain things. I wrote down what he said, dated it, and started keeping a separate set of records. By the time my husband made his call from Scottsdale, I had documented $218,000 in fraudulent vendor payments, invoices from 2 companies that, when I paid a business research firm to investigate, turned out to share a registered agent with a personal LLC in Clifford's name. I had not gone to the authorities yet. I want to explain why, because I've been asked this question, including by the investigator who eventually handled the case, and the answer matters. I waited because I needed the evidence to be complete. Not enough to raise suspicion, enough to be irrefutable. I had watched what happened to women in financial disputes who moved too early. They got dismissed, negotiated down, and the story became about their emotional state rather than the facts. I was not going to let that happen. I needed every document dated, every transaction traced, every company incorporated before anyone looked at it. By the time I turned it over, there was nothing left to dispute. My husband's attorney received a certified letter on a Thursday morning. It contained a summary of the Clifford situation, a notice that the documentation had been forwarded to the Arizona Attorney General's Financial Fraud Unit, and a single line at the end, "Please advise your client that his business manager is the subject of a pending investigation and that his own name appears in 3 of the vendor communication chains." His attorney called Rosemary within the hour. I was seeing patients. She texted me between appointments, "They want to talk." I texted back, "Tuesday works." The Tuesday meeting was brief. His attorney came alone, no husband. He put a revised proposal on the table. My husband would relinquish all claims to the practice and its assets. He would sign a full separation agreement within 30 days. He was asking only for his personal belongings, the vehicle in his name, and what was in his individual checking account. I read the proposal. Then I said, he also needs to sign a statement confirming he had no knowledge of or participation in the vendor fraud. Rosemary looked at me. If he had no knowledge, I said, he should have no problem signing. There was a pause. His attorney said he'd need to consult with his client. Of course, I said. I'll need an answer by Friday. I got it Thursday. He signed everything. The investigation into Clifford took another 4 months. The AG's office found 2 additional vendor schemes I hadn't identified, which brought the total to just over $300,000. He was charged with wire fraud and theft by deception. The case was resolved the following spring. I wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing, but Rosemary was. She texted me a photo of the docket. The divorce was final on a Wednesday in October. I went back to the office after the courthouse. We had a staff meeting that afternoon, and I stood at the front of the room and told my team, 14 people, most of whom had been with me for more than 5 years, that the practice was stable, that there were no ownership changes, and that the person who had been managing vendor operations was no longer employed there and was under investigation. I told them the truth. I didn't perform it. There was a young medical assistant in the back who started crying, not dramatically, just quietly, and said, "We knew something was wrong. We just didn't know if we were allowed to say anything." I thought about that for a long time afterward. What I understand now, and didn't fully understand when I was in the middle of it, is that the hardest part wasn't the legal work or the documentation, or even the loneliness of keeping it all to myself for almost a year. The hardest part was the period before I had all the evidence, when I knew what I knew but couldn't yet prove it, and I had to come in every morning and do my job and be professional and act like nothing was wrong. I had to shake Clifford's hand. I had to sit across from my husband at the dinner table. I had to perform normalcy while quietly building the case that would dismantle his. Some people, when I've told parts of this story, ask if I regret not confronting him sooner. If I wish I'd said something the night I found the hotel receipt. I understand why they ask, but the answer is no. Not because I'm cold, but because I know what a confrontation that night would have produced. Denial, an argument, maybe a temporary reconciliation, and a man who would have been much more careful going forward. The evidence I needed would have disappeared. I would have been the emotional wife who jumped to conclusions, and he would have been the patient husband who forgave her for it. By waiting, I gave him 11 months to keep doing exactly what he was doing, in exactly the ways he was always going to do it. I didn't trap him. I just didn't interrupt him. The practice is doing well. We opened a 4th location in Gilbert 18 months after the divorce was final. I brought on a new operations director, a woman with an MBA and a background in hospital administration who reads every contract before she signs it and has never once asked me to initial something she hasn't already explained to me in full. Her name is Corinne, and she is worth every dollar. My husband, last I heard, had moved to Scottsdale permanently. I genuinely hope he is well. I don't say that to sound gracious. I say it because I am not caring anything about him anymore, and wishing someone poorly takes energy I have stopped allocating to that account. Tatum, I am told, is no longer in the picture. That is not my business, and I don't dwell on it. What I think about, sometimes in the early mornings before the clinic opens, is what it cost me to stay quiet for that year. The weight of it. The discipline it required, every day, to choose patience over reaction. I was trained to do that in medicine. To observe, to document, to wait for the full picture before acting. It turns out the same skill applies to the rest of life. My grandmother, who left me the money that started all of this, used to say that the most powerful thing a woman can do is decide exactly how much of herself she is willing to spend on a person. She was a practical woman. She kept records too. I think about her when I walk into that building in the morning. My name is on the door. It always was. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the day he called from Scottsdale, not the Tuesday meeting when his attorney folded. It's the moment my medical assistant, standing in the back of the staff room with her eyes wet, said, "We knew something was wrong. We just didn't know if we were allowed to say anything." That stayed with me longer than anything else in this whole ordeal, because it pointed at something I hadn't fully named yet, that the people around us often see the truth before we're ready to say it out loud. And the question isn't whether the truth exists. It's whether we have the character to do something about it, even when doing something is slow, unglamorous, and requires us to sit with discomfort for a very long time. I think about what it took to get through that year. Not the legal strategy. Rosemary handled most of that with more precision than I ever could have managed alone. I mean the internal work. The discipline of coming in every morning knowing what I knew, shaking Clifford's hand, sitting across from my husband at dinner, and choosing again and again not to move until I was ready. That's not coldness. I want to be clear about that. It was a decision rooted in something I believe deeply, that acting from clarity is more powerful than reacting from pain. The pain was real. I felt all of it. I just refused to let it set my timeline. What Clifford did was a choice. What my husband did was a choice. And what I did, the 11 months of documentation, the carefully structured trust, the vendor audit, the decision to bring in authorities only when the case was airtight, those were choices too. Actions have trajectories. They land somewhere. Clifford's $300,000 in fraudulent invoices didn't disappear because he was clever. They left a paper trail the same way every decision we make leaves something behind, readable to anyone patient enough to look. What I learned, what I am still learning, honestly, is that real strength in a crisis is in loudness. It's not the confrontation in the kitchen. It's not the dramatic scene where you finally say everything you've been holding back. It's the quiet accumulation of doing the right thing, the careful thing, the documented thing, over and over, when no one is watching and no one is applauding. My grandmother kept records. I kept records. There is a kind of integrity in that practice that I didn't fully appreciate until I needed it, and the intelligence required. I don't mean book intelligence. I mean the willingness to think past your own hurt, to ask what the full picture looks like, to understand that rushing toward the most emotionally satisfying move is often the least strategic one. That was something I had to choose to apply. It was available to me my whole life. I just had to decide to use it in this situation too. The same way I use it with a patient whose diagnosis is complicated and whose symptoms don't yet add up. The practice is still mine. My name was always on the door. And the reason it is, the real reason, not the legal one, is that I did not give up on the version of myself that built it in the first place. That's the only thing, in the end, that nobody can sell.